recent paper entitled The State of the Art, The Way of the Future, Dr. Jennifer Murray from the University of Toronto and the author of the Remarkable Cultures of Diplomacy praised the deep transformations and the renewal experienced by diplomatic history in the past 15 years. Now, from what Dr. Murray characterized in her article as an ailing field in the early 2000s, diplomatic history and the scholars who specialize in it have turned their eyes and energy towards researching non-European conceptions and practices of diplomacy, but also material and cultural aspects of diplomacy and diplomats, as well as the often overlooked diplomatic influence and power exerted by the so-called subaltern or peripheral actors such as women, artists, intermediaries, or merchants, especially in the early modern period. Now, regarding that very last category, that is merchants and the mercantile community as a whole, Dr. Murray wrote, and I quote, "A sphere of research innovation that lies in work on the consular service, which began to expand in numbers, offices, and geopolitical reach during the closing decades of the 18th century." Now, that last sentence is, in my opinion, and in line with my own research that covers British and French commercial diplomacies in Spain in that period, is absolutely key. At the turn of the 19th century, that is roughly the period from the end of the War of American Independence until the definitive defeat of Napoleon in 1815, is a formative and turning point both in terms of diplomatic activity and commercial competition between two rival imperialisms, Britain and France. As a study of consuls throughout this historical sequence, that culmination of what some scholars coined the Second 100 Years' War between Britain and France, is essential. Spain and its dominions, the Spanish market, although the term is to some extent inappropriate and slightly anachronistic, and I would refer to the work of Guillermo Pérez Sarrión on the formation of the Spanish market during that period. But the Spanish dominions, the Spanish market, so to speak, represented both a source of specie for the two rivals, Britain and France, and an indispensable outlet for their respective domestic productions, especially in textiles, all of which fueled their domestic economies and allowed them to sustain their decade-long struggle against one another. Now, in theory, all trade aimed to Spanish colonies had to go through the peninsula. It was not possible to have a direct trade between Britain and the Spanish colonies in South America, for example. So the Spanish peninsula, in regards to consular activity, was therefore a central stage, as consuls and vice-consuls posted there were entrusted with the task of protecting and enforcing commercial privileges on behalf of their country fellowmen who were dealing and trading with Spain and the Spanish market, as well as gathering and reporting commercial intelligence to their hierarchy, to their superiors in their homeland, that is, in France or in Britain. Now, it would be extremely difficult, in my opinion, to deny that in the field of consular studies, there has been a true Francophilia. Concluding his overview of the academic literature dedicated to the history of consuls, Jörg Elbert, for example, pondered that, for instance, a solely 25% of all the available academic literature related to consuls covered actually French consuls, a clear demonstration in his view and also in mine of the weight of the French consular experience in the field. Now, it is undeniably true that French-speaking academics and scholars have consistently used French archives and extensively published on the subject, underlining the modern traits of the consular institution in the wake of the Colbert reforms in the late 17th century. But the Spanish context has taken a particular importance. Well, first because, as I said, Spain was a major market, the first foreign market for French manufacturers and traders. And second, because the French consular network was the most ancient and the most developed by far, in comparison to other nations, by the end of the 18th century. However, these scholarly works tend to focus their attention to the period anterior to the French Revolution, which might be described as the golden years of the French commercial presence in the peninsula. Most, not to say all publications, stopped either in 1789 with the traditional end of the Ancien Régime, or 1792, 1793, when the political, diplomatic, and military rupture was active between the new French Republic and the members of the first coalition, among whom was, of course, Spain, the Kingdom of Spain. But of course, French consuls operating in Spain did not cease to exist in July 1789, nor they disappeared into thin air in 1793. They returned for the most part to the peninsula, for example, in 1796, when the Peace of Basel put an end to Franco-Spanish hostilities. And despite the many fluctuations in the following years, they still fulfilled their duties. So in my opinion, and this is what I would argue today, there is an excellent case to make, and it has been recently made for French diplomats during the revolution by Linda and Marshall Frey, for example, in their book published in 2018, and by Virginie Martin a bit earlier in her unpublished dissertation on French diplomats in the Italian peninsula. That French agents abroad, including in our particular case today, consuls, were perhaps more than other bodies in a very paradoxical situation under the various revolutionary regimes. They were living in a foreign country, and yet they were at the service of France. Most of them were men of the Ancien Régime, and yet they were expecting to show a full loyalty and even at some point an ideological compliance. They were directly under the supervision of Paris, but with enough physical distance as to grant them more agency, perhaps, and more liberty in the implementation of orders and the narrative of their action. They were protected by treaties and conventions, and yet they were the target of a growing distrust and a growing suspicion, and even physical violence on the part of local communities and authorities in Spain during those years. So my objective today is to lay down some ideas and to develop some avenues of research that I've explored and that I have formed regarding French consuls while going through French archives for my PhD, but also using Spanish archives that provide a better understanding perhaps of the local context in those years, as well as British primary resources that, in my opinion, offer a vital counterpoint and a different perspective than the one displayed only in French accounts regarding French consuls in that time. So my presentation will be divided in three main parts. The first will address what I would call the institutional and the structural transformations that influence the work and the trajectories of French consuls in Spain, in the peninsula during those years. My second main part will cover what I would call the cultural and social transformations that affected French consuls, but that were also made by them during those years, in this period, the 1790s and in the early 1800s. And the last part will look at how allies, enemies, and also French subjects and then citizens on the ground in Spain were observing and were interacting with French consuls at the time. So going back to that first part about the institutional transformations that affected French consuls. My first point would sound perhaps counterintuitive in the sense that nothing actually changed for French consuls in the very first months of the French Revolution. The political developments that occurred in France up until 1792 and the end of the monarchy did not overtly affect the consular staff posted in Spain. For consuls, vice-consuls, secretaries, interprets who worked within the dozen of French consulates in Spain at the time, it was, as a person today might say, business as usual. Now, the French consular institution had been modeled by a series of decrees since the late 17th century to become a professional, trained, and also closely supervised body that vastly differed from its counterparts in other countries, who still relied mostly on merchant consuls, such as was the case for Britain, for British consuls, who were actually merchants themselves. On the other hand, French consuls were prohibited from taking part in commercial enterprises of their own. Their sole duty was therefore to fulfill their consular mission, because they were what one might call civil servants. And they had been selected for this purpose. They had not bought their consulship, which was the case for other consuls of other nations. And so it is quite striking to see in the French records kept, for example, in the Archives Diplomatiques in Nantes or in Paris, how little the lives of many of these consuls were affected at first, in the first month and in the first years of the French Revolution. In their correspondence with the embassy, the French embassy in Madrid, for example, or more importantly with Paris, the same matters still occupy their thoughts. The same questions related to navigation matters, to customs, to the management and the relationship with their local French community in the Spanish ports, for example, and their own personal advancement. So the objective of his first remark, of his first point, might come across to some as extremely obvious, but I believe it's still interesting and it's still necessary to highlight that there were strong continuities, at least at first, both in terms of staff and in terms of practices, in terms of language, and in terms of subjects of consular activity. I'm also stressing that point because the French Revolution is often used as sometimes an artificial chronological border, which is not always an operating concept for different government bodies. A second point that I would like to stress is that from 1792 onwards, French consuls in Spain, but also elsewhere in other European countries, for example, witnessed many changes in their relationship and their exchanges with their hierarchy in Paris. A major change occurred in 1791, 1792 that certainly reflected the new political state of mind and the new conception of what consuls, French consuls, would be under the new political regime and the new circumstances. Now, traditionally, French consuls did not report to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as one might have expected or anticipated. They were put directly under the authority of the Navy Secretary. The Bureau des Consulats, which was the institutional umbrella, the government entity in charge of dealing with consuls, was placed in the Navy Secretary. Now, that situation certainly reflected the balance of power that existed in the French government at the end of the 17th century and the role played by Colbert, but it was also the product of a certain conception of consuls. Consulates and consuls were about mostly navigation, they were mostly posted in seaports. They were about trade, commercial matters, circulation and transportation of goods and individuals. That many consuls exerted a diplomatic influence or worked as para-diplomatic or diplomatic agents had been clearly demonstrated before, and there is, for example, a brilliant PhD thesis still unpublished by Sylvain Rioult, that was defended in 2018, that exposed the role of the agent de la marine et du commerce at the French embassy in the 18th century, the French embassy in Madrid, sorry. Now, this subordination link with the Navy ended in 1791 and 1792, in line with the deep reorganization of the executive and legislative powers in Paris. Virginie Martin, for example, explored how these structural changes affected the work of French diplomats and diplomacy in general. And I would refer here to her work on the Comité Diplomatique, for example. Now, from this period onwards, French consuls had two authorities. They had two superiors, so to speak. Their work was split. For all navigation matters, they still reported to the Navy, but for the rest, they reported to the Foreign Affairs Secretary. Now, the extreme volatility of the Foreign Affairs Secretary in the following years, in the 1790s, meant that on the ground, that is in Spain, consuls were often in despair at the lack of communication or instruction that they were receiving, or rather not receiving, from Paris. And also a strong point to highlight is what is often called the tyranny of distance, that played a big role in the relationship between Paris and the French consuls on the ground in the peninsula. And we tend to forget how geographical distance certainly influenced historical actors. Cadix, which was the most important French consulate in Spain, in Andalusia, in the south of Spain, because it was the most important Spanish port, and it was a colonial port of Spain, is a good example of that. Poirel, who was the French consul there in the early 1790s, sometimes hinted at this problem in his correspondence, complaining that he was not receiving enough information. It took roughly 10 days, or sometimes 2 weeks or even more, for a letter to go from Paris to Cadix. So we can easily imagine how difficult it was for French consuls in the peninsula to sometimes understand and even follow the chain of events that were happening in Paris, and that would sometimes radically change the political status, sometimes overnight. As this is a work in progress, that is part of my PhD, I'm still in the process of not just identifying these men, these French consuls, but also in the process of piecing together their respective trajectories. And while some of them were certainly able to retain their consular responsibilities through the years, some others simply disappeared from the consular records, or at least they were no longer consuls in the French consular institution. And so it is very difficult to understand how some of these men were capable of going through the years of the revolutionary period, and some others were not. And it's certainly an avenue of research for me, but I hope for other scholars as well, to do what one would call a prosopography of French consuls in those years, to really be able to understand their trajectories and how they went through these institutional changes and the political changes of the time. Now, a second part of this presentation addresses the cultural and social transformation of the consular network in Spain at the time. And my first point would look at what it meant for some of these consuls to perform and to become a Republican agent. In relation to Paris, to their authority, but also in relation to the local context, to the Spanish context. Now, from 1793 onwards, some consuls in Spain, and it's very visible in the records, developed and displayed what one might call a Republican identity, or at least a patriotic identity. And the question of whether they fully believed or not in what they were performing, or if it was an instrument and a tool for them in order to preserve and to maintain their status as French consuls and as a French civil servant in Spain, is still open. But I think it's very interesting to look at the signs and look at what it meant, the symbols as well, the rituals, the different practices that they were performing or displaying of this Republican or patriotic identity. And in two different shapes, and it's quite identifiable in the correspondence and in the reports. In some instances, it was about wearing a uniform, and there are some letters from French consuls on the ground asking for the right, the permission to wear a uniform of French consuls in Spain that would use certain colors related to the French flag or to the new regime in France, the use of the cockade on their hats. There were also calls from some French consuls to display outside of their house or inside their house, that is a consular house, some signs of their role as consul, but also some sign of their loyalty towards the French Republican regime. And all this language, this political language and this visual language of being a Republican consul in a foreign country is extremely important to look at and to address. It would be part of what one might call a Republican grammar. And some of these French consuls were very proactive in the sense that they would ask Paris and they would ask their authorities for the permission to really present themselves in Spain, in the public sphere in Spain, as representatives of the new regime, and they would try to embody the values or the mottos of the French Revolution and of the French Republic after 1792 and 1793. What is also interesting, I think, is the gap that can exist between the discourse and the reality. Some of these consuls were certainly presenting themselves in their correspondence as very loyal French citizens, as very loyal partisans of the new Republican regime. But what was the reality? What was the reality of their adherence to these new principles and to this new political regime? That is still up for debate. And there is also an unnecessary gap between also the orders and the guidelines, and sometimes the letters that were sent from Paris to them on the ground in the peninsula, in Spain, in Cadix, in Alicante, in Madrid, that they were supposed to embody these new values and these new principles of the Republican regime. What was the reality? it's very difficult to detach the performative nature of the discourse and the reality of their adhesion and of their loyalty toward the Republican regime. Now, some would certainly argue, and it's very interesting to look at, that some consuls were performing this Republican identity and this very patriotic identity as a way for them to protect their individual careers. Now, in theory, in the French consular network, it was not possible to form a consular dynasty. It was not possible to transmit a consulship to your son or to your nephew. But in practice, it was certainly the case that there were family interests in obtaining and keeping and retaining these consular responsibilities. So one of the possibilities, one of the ways to explain this representation and this performance of a Republican identity was a justification to preserve and to protect and to maintain a status as French consuls in Spain. So the social trajectories have to be compared with the discourse and the embodiment that these French consuls were displaying on the ground. Now, the last key part of this presentation would be to look at what people on the ground, the Spanish people, but also the French community on the ground, and also the British consuls on the ground, were thinking and what they were observing and what was their opinion about these French consuls. The Spanish authorities had a very particular attitude towards French consuls during those years, but it is important to highlight that the attitude of the Spanish authorities was towards French consuls was intertwined with their attitude towards French subjects and then French citizens in general in those years. Spanish authorities were very wary and very worried about a potential revolutionary contagion in Spain. And so they were looking at the French citizens living in Spain and also at French consuls. The attitude of the Spanish authorities towards French consuls in those years is intertwined with the attitude of the Spanish authorities towards French subjects and French citizens living in Spain in those years in general. There were two main factors explaining the attitude of the Spanish authorities. The first was a political one, and the second was more a pragmatic one. The first was that the Spanish authorities were very wary of what they described as a revolutionary contagion in Spain, and so they progressively considered French subjects living in Spain, but also French consuls, as a potential enemy from within, or at least as a group that would probably become a political faction that would influence the policy of Spain from within. And so they implemented in 1791, 1793, but also in the years following, a series of measures that aimed at controlling the French subjects and French citizens living in Spain, but also that aimed at forcing them to relinquish their citizenship as French and to become Spanish subjects. As I said, it was motivated by the threat of political contagion in Spain, but it was also an economic objective, because French citizens and French consuls enjoyed a series of privileges while residing in Spain. It was in the interest of Spanish authorities to reduce these privileges. And so French consuls were looked with a growing suspicion on the part of Spanish authorities. They were seen as political agents. They were seen as potential spies that would transmit information to Paris regarding the state of the Spanish Navy, for example, in the Spanish seaports. The second point in that part that I would like to make was regarding British consuls who were also residing in Spain at the time. French consuls grew suspicious of British consuls because they thought that British consuls were acting in collaboration with Spanish authorities in order to undermine the privileges of the privileges of French consuls in Spain. But there were instances of collaboration between French consuls and British consuls in order to push back against the Spanish authorities, there were also much more often instances of hostility on the part of French consuls towards British consuls, because French consuls were convinced, some of them were convinced that British consuls were working as enemies, were working against France's interest, but also against their interest in Spain. And the third point, the last point that I wanted to make was regarding French subjects and French citizens living in Spain. The relationship between French consuls and French citizens and French subjects living in Spain was a complicated one before the revolution. But French consuls were more and more asked to operate a surveillance of French citizens living in Spain to report to the Paris authorities. And so there was a rift that probably increased between some parts of some French citizens living in Spain and French consuls. And so there were more and more instances of also suspicion and sometimes even hostility between some French citizens in Spain and French consuls. So to conclude this presentation, the main idea that I wanted to develop and that I want to pursue in the next month and also in the next year in my PhD research is that French consuls during those years in the 1790s were certainly affected and influenced by the political events occurring in France, at the time, but they were also active and they had a very sometimes nuanced attitude towards what was happening in France. Some of them used this to try to maintain their status. Some of them were displaying a very strong Republican identity, but they were also facing hostility, opposition, and sometimes conflict on the ground in Spain. And there were more, the key point was that there were more and more, for some of them, perceived as political agents by Spanish authorities. And so they were more and more confronted with hostile activity and hostile action on the part of the Spanish government on the ground. Thank you.